The day the police boat cut across the lake toward my cabin, I knew this wasn't just another HOA warning. A woman from the shoreline stood pointing at my porch, shouting that I was trespassing on her community, demanding I be removed immediately. Minutes earlier, she'd called 911, claiming I was an illegal squatter who refused to leave. What she didn't know was that every step she took to humiliate me was already collapsing under its own lies. The land records, the boundaries, the authority she thought she had, none of it belonged to her. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just embarrass her, it unraveled the power structure of the entire neighborhood. So how did a quiet lakeside cabin turn into the stage for the most shocking HOA reversal this county had ever seen? Before any patrol lights cut across the water or anyone started throwing around words like trespassing and authority, life at the cabin was quiet in the way only remote places can be. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but settled. I'd owned that small lakeside cabin for years, long before the surrounding land became attractive to developers, investors, and people who like to call themselves community leaders. It wasn't a vacation rental or a weekend escape. It was where I went to disappear from noise, deadlines, and expectations. The cabin sat back from the water, framed by tall pines and an old dock that had seen better decades. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, and evenings ended with the lake reflecting whatever sky had felt like wearing that night. Neighbors were distant, but polite. Most kept to themselves, which was exactly the unspoken agreement I valued. No one asked questions, no one gave instructions, at least not at first. Over time, the area changed. What had once been scattered cabins and inherited plots slowly filled with larger homes, manicured lawns, and matching mailboxes. A homeowners association appeared almost overnight, promising order, value protection, and community standards. I didn't attend their meetings. I didn't vote on their rules. My property had its own history, its own deed, and its own boundaries that predated the glossy brochures being slid into mailboxes. At first, the HOA felt like background noise. Signs went up, notices appeared on poles near the road, conversations happened at the far end of the lake that didn't concern me, or so I thought. I kept maintaining my cabin the same way I always had, fixing what broke and leaving the rest alone. Nothing I did changed. What changed was how closely certain people started watching. It began with small, uncomfortable moments, a slow-moving golf cart passing my driveway more often than necessary, a woman standing near the waterline, staring a second too long when I stepped onto the dock, a flyer taped to a post near my property line, listing community expectations that didn't apply to me, yet somehow felt directed straight at my front door. I ignored it. People love rules when they think those rules belong to them. I assumed the curiosity would fade once they realized I wasn't interested in joining their version of lakeside perfection. But curiosity doesn't fade when it's fueled by control. It sharpens. One afternoon, as I was repairing a loose plank on the dock, a voice carried across the water, firm, practiced, and already irritated. Someone was asking whether I belonged there, not who I was, not how long I'd lived there, just whether I belonged. That was the first moment I felt the shift. The unspoken agreement of distance was gone, replaced by a quiet assessment of power. I went back to the cabin that evening with a feeling I couldn't shake. The land hadn't changed, the water hadn't changed, but the way the community looked at that cabin had. And somewhere between the new rules, the watchful eyes, and the growing sense of entitlement, a line had been drawn, one I hadn't agreed to, and one I had no intention of stepping back from. Because when people start deciding who belongs and who doesn't, they rarely stop at asking questions. What followed that first question wasn't a confrontation, it was pressure. Quiet at first, then deliberate. The kind designed to make someone uncomfortable without ever admitting that was the goal. Within a week, I found an envelope taped to a wooden post near my driveway. Not mailed, not addressed, just placed there like a marker. Inside was a notice from the HOA outlining Lakeside access guidelines, dock compliance standards, and a reminder that unauthorized structures were subject to removal. No name, no signature, just authority assumed and unchallenged. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling that slow, familiar irritation rise. None of it applied to me. My dock predated the HOA by decades. The cabin wasn't built under their jurisdiction. The land records were clear. But the notice wasn't about accuracy. It was about testing whether I would respond. I didn't. That's when the visits began. Cars slowed near my property, sometimes stopping just long enough for someone inside to take photos. A clipboard appeared one afternoon, held by a man who stood at the edge of my driveway without stepping onto it, like that technicality made everything acceptable. He never introduced himself, just nodded, wrote something down, and left. Soon, the notices became more specific. One cited improper shoreline usage. Another referenced non-compliant exterior maintenance, pointing out the natural wood siding of the cabin as if it were an offense. Each letter carried a warning about escalating fines, though none listed an amount, just the promise of consequence. I called the number printed at the bottom of the page once, only once. The woman who answered spoke in rehearsed phrases, calm, controlled, and uninterested in explanations. She told me the HOA was clarifying boundaries and that cooperation would prevent misunderstandings. When I mentioned my deed, she paused, then said someone would get back to me. They never did. Instead, a bright orange tag appeared on my dock one morning, flapping slightly in the breeze. It declared the structure under review for safety violations. No inspector had been there, no measurements taken, just a label meant to make the problem visible, to me and to anyone watching from the lake. That was the moment frustration turned into resolve. I pulled out my property documents that night, spreading them across the kitchen table. Old surveys, boundary maps, transfer records, everything that tied that cabin to my name and that land to a history older than the HOA itself. The lines were clear, painfully clear, but clarity doesn't matter when the other side isn't interested in truth. The next escalation came fast. A fine appeared in my mailbox, this one mailed properly, with my name spelled wrong and my address partially incorrect. It cited continued non-compliance and warned of additional action if payment wasn't received within 10 days. The amount was arbitrary, but the implication wasn't. This wasn't about dock planks or siding anymore. It was about submission. I ignored the fine. 2 days later, someone placed a no trespassing sign at the edge of my own property line, facing inward. That was deliberate, petty, and effective. Neighbors I'd barely interacted with before now looked at the cabin differently. Some avoided eye contact, others watched openly. The woman I'd seen near the shoreline, the one with the practiced authority in her voice, started appearing more often. She never spoke to me directly. She didn't have to. Her presence carried the message. One afternoon, as I returned from town, I found her standing with 2 other HOA board members near the dock. They were pointing, gesturing, discussing my property like it was already theirs. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there, listening from a distance, hearing phrases like enforcement, precedent, and setting an example. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't personal, not yet. This was strategic. The HOA wasn't just trying to remove a cabin or control a dock. They were trying to erase an exception. My property didn't fit their model. It disrupted their authority. And as long as it existed untouched, it reminded everyone else that the HOA's power had limits. So they needed me gone, or broken. The pressure intensified. Emails replaced letters. The tone shifted from procedural to accusatory.
I was now being described as uncooperative, hostile, and in violation of community standards. One message warned that continued resistance could lead to external enforcement involvement. That phrase sat heavy. External enforcement didn't mean another fine. It meant the kind of escalation that turned paperwork into spectacle. And then, one morning, a patrol vehicle appeared on the road leading to the lake. It didn't stop, just passed slowly, like a reminder that someone else had been invited into a conflict that didn't belong to them. I spent that day at the cabin, waiting, watching the water, listening to engines in the distance. Every sound felt loaded, every shadow on the trees stretched a little longer than it should have. The peace that once defined the place was gone, replaced by a tension that pressed against the walls. That evening, another notice arrived, this one hand-delivered. It claimed I was trespassing on HOA-managed land and demanded I vacate the property pending review. No legal backing, no court order, just a command. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was bold. They weren't asking anymore. They were daring me. I contacted a local records office the next morning, requesting certified copies of historical land documents. The clerk's reaction told me everything. She raised an eyebrow, asked which parcel I meant, then nodded slowly when I explained. "That one," she said. "We don't see disputes there often." By the time I returned to the cabin, the HOA had already moved on to the next step. Signs appeared along the lake path warning residents about unauthorized occupancy. My cabin was never named, but it didn't have to be. Everyone knew, and everyone was watching to see what would happen when authority met resistance. The final warning came late in the afternoon, delivered not by mail or email, but by voice. The woman, the one who always stood just far enough away, called out from the shoreline, informing me that law enforcement would be contacted if I didn't leave immediately. She said it calmly, confidently, like the outcome was already decided. I didn't respond. I just stood there, looking out over the water, feeling the weight of everything that had led to that moment. The fines, the signs, the surveillance, the assumption that pressure would eventually force compliance. What they didn't know was that every step they took only anchored me deeper into place. Because when people try to push you off land you legally own, they're not just overstepping boundaries, they're setting themselves up for a reckoning. And the call they were about to make would change everything.
The moment the police boat cut across the lake, everything compressed into a single, unbearable clarity. The water that had always felt open and endless suddenly felt narrow, like a corridor closing in. The engine's wake rippled outward, disturbing the stillness that had once defined the place. From the shoreline, people gathered, some openly, others pretending to be busy while watching everything unfold. This was no longer a private dispute. It had become a public test of authority. The HOA president stood at the edge of the water, arms crossed, posture rigid with certainty. This was the outcome she had been steering toward for weeks. Fines hadn't worked, signs hadn't worked, pressure hadn't worked. So she escalated to the one thing she believed would force compliance: law enforcement. In her mind, this ended with removal, humiliation, and proof that resistance was pointless. The officers approached with professional caution, scanning the cabin, the dock, the surrounding land. They weren't aggressive, but they weren't relaxed either. A 911 call carries weight, and they treated it that way. The claim was simple and damning: illegal occupancy, refusal to vacate, trespassing on HOA-controlled land. Enough buzzwords to justify showing up, enough confidence behind the call to suggest it would be resolved quickly. But certainty has a weakness. It assumes the ground beneath it is solid. As the officers stepped onto the dock, I felt the full weight of the situation settle in. This was the peak of the pressure campaign, the moment the HOA had been building toward. Every notice, every fine, every watchful stare had led here. The calm I'd maintained until now wasn't confidence, it was preparation, because I knew something they didn't. While the HOA president gestured from the shoreline, reinforcing her version of events, the officers began the procedural checks: names, property boundaries, jurisdiction, routine questions meant to establish facts. And that's when the first fracture appeared. The parcel number didn't match. The officer reviewing the call details paused, checking the information again. The location tied to the complaint didn't align with the county records they had on file. The boundaries didn't line up with HOA-managed land. That pause, brief but unmistakable, shifted the energy of the entire scene. The HOA president doubled down. Authority always does when it senses doubt. She pointed harder, insisted louder, leaned into the assumption that confidence alone could override paperwork. But law enforcement doesn't operate on assumption, it operates on records. And the records told a different story. The officers contacted their dispatcher, requesting confirmation on the property designation. What came back wasn't immediate, and the waiting stretched thin. The lake was silent except for the hum of the idling boat. Neighbors stood frozen, caught between expectation and uncertainty. This was no longer about removing someone from a cabin. It was about discovering who had the right to make the call in the first place. When the confirmation finally came through, it landed like a dropped weight. The land wasn't HOA managed. Not partially, not historically, not accidentally. It never had been. The cabin sat on a parcel governed by a separate set of records, boundaries established long before the HOA existed, boundaries that placed not just the cabin, but significant surrounding land outside their jurisdiction entirely. And as the officers continued digging, prompted by the sheer confidence with which the HOA had overreached, something even larger surfaced. The ownership structure was not what anyone expected. What had been dismissed as a stubborn homeowner refusing to comply was in fact the legal owner of multiple connected parcels, parcels that extended beyond the cabin, parcels that intersected with access routes, shoreline usage rights, and easements the HOA had been quietly assuming control over for years. The realization spread slowly, like a crack widening across glass. The HOA president's posture changed first. Her certainty faltered, replaced by confusion that quickly hardened into disbelief. This couldn't be possible. It couldn't be. The system wasn't supposed to work this way. She had rules. She had enforcement. She had power. But power collapses the moment it outruns legitimacy. The officers stepped back, recalibrating. The call that had brought them there was no longer valid. Worse, it had been based on false claims of authority. The situation inverted in real time. What was supposed to be an eviction turned into a review of the HOA's conduct, of their claims, of their reach. Neighbors whispered. Phones came out. The spectacle the HOA had engineered to assert dominance was now exposing its overreach. The humiliation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was procedural, methodical, far more damaging. As the officers explained the findings, the HOA president tried to interrupt, to redirect, to regain footing, but each attempt only underscored the truth she couldn't escape. She had called 911 on someone who was not only within their rights to be there, but whose ownership complicated the HOA's authority far beyond this single dispute. The lake felt different now, not tense, but charged. What followed was not an apology or a quiet retreat. It was worse. The officers documented the false report. They noted the misuse of emergency services. They advised the HOA to cease contact immediately and warned that any further interference could result in legal consequences. The crowd didn't disperse right away. People lingered, absorbing what they'd just witnessed. The power dynamic that had seemed so rigid minutes earlier had dissolved completely. The HOA wasn't the final authority. It never had been. It had just been loud enough, long enough, that no one had challenged it. Until now.
The HOA president left the shoreline without another word, her confidence replaced by a tight, brittle silence. The spectacle she'd orchestrated had backfired in the most public way possible. Not only had she failed to remove me, she'd exposed the fragility of the system she relied on to control others. As the police boat pulled away, the lake slowly returned to stillness, but nothing else did. The cabin stood exactly where it always had, untouched. The dock creaked gently with the water's movement, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded on top of it. This wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the moment everything shifted. Because once authority is challenged and exposed, it doesn't disappear quietly. It retaliates, restructures, or collapses. And the fallout from that call was only just beginning.
The days after the police boat left were quieter than anything that had come before, but not calmer. Silence has a way of amplifying consequences. The lake returned to its glassy stillness, birds reclaimed the shoreline, and the dock creaked the same way it always had. Yet beneath that calm, the entire balance of the neighborhood had shifted. The HOA stopped contacting me immediately. No emails, no notices, no clipboards hovering at the edge of my driveway. The signs along the lake path disappeared within 48 hours, pulled down as quietly as they'd gone up. Even the orange tag on the dock was gone one morning, leaving behind a small rectangle of cleaner wood where it had once flapped like a warning flag. That alone would have been satisfying, but it wasn't the real resolution. It was only the pause before reality set in. Because what that 911 call had done wasn't just embarrass one person, it triggered scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't stop at the original complaint, it spreads. Within a week, I received a formal letter, not from the HOA, but from the county. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't threatening, it was careful, measured. They were conducting a review of land use complaints in the Lakeside area following a misreported emergency call. They requested documentation, not because they doubted me, but because they needed to understand how a homeowners association had asserted authority where it didn't exist. I gave them everything. Certified deeds, historical surveys, boundary maps that predated most of the houses now ringing the lake, records showing how parcels had been split, sold, inherited, and quietly absorbed into assumptions that were never legally tested. The cabin, it turned out, wasn't the anomaly, it was the anchor. The more the county reviewed, the clearer the picture became. The HOA hadn't just overstepped with me, they had been operating in a gray zone for years, enforcing rules based on convenience rather than jurisdiction. No one had challenged it because no one wanted to be the problem. No one wanted to be watched, fined, or singled out until they picked the wrong property. The HOA president resigned less than a month later. There was no announcement, no apology, just a quiet update buried in a meeting agenda most residents didn't attend. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew. You don't recover easily from publicly misusing emergency services to remove someone who was legally untouchable. What followed was a slow unraveling. Residents began asking questions, not aggressively, but curiously, about boundaries, about fees, about where HOA authority actually ended. The same confidence that once enforced silence now invited doubt, and doubt spreads faster than rules ever do. I heard from neighbors I'd never spoken to before. Some apologized, not for anything specific, but for assuming the HOA was always right. Others shared stories, quietly, cautiously, like they were testing whether it was safe now. Fines that never made sense, threats that felt exaggerated, compliance demanded without explanation. What they saw at the lake changed something fundamental. They saw authority challenged and lose. The HOA attempted to reassert itself through formal channels, issuing revised guidelines and scheduling meetings. Attendance was lower than expected. Questions were sharper than they'd been before.
References to community standards were met with requests for legal citations. The illusion of absolute control was gone, replaced with something far more fragile: accountability. As for me, the county's review concluded with clarity. The land was mine, always had been. More than that, the surrounding easements and access routes tied to my parcels meant the HOA would need to renegotiate certain assumptions they'd treated as fact for years. Their authority shrank, not dramatically, but decisively. Lines were redrawn, jurisdiction corrected, and with that correction came limits. No one called it a victory publicly, but everyone felt it. Life at the cabin returned to a version of normal. Not the old normal, but a quieter, earned one. The looks from across the water softened. The golf cart stopped circling. The shoreline felt less like a stage and more like a place again. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post signs. I didn't remind anyone what had happened. I didn't need to. The absence of interference was proof enough. Months later, I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, and thought about how easily this could have gone the other way. How many people would have packed up, paid the fine, left quietly, assuming resistance wasn't worth the cost. How many already had. HOAs thrive on that assumption, not because they're always wrong, but because they're rarely challenged. Their power doesn't come from laws alone. It comes from confidence, repetition, and the belief that no one will push back hard enough to test the limits. But limits exist, and when someone crosses them loud enough, the consequences don't stop with embarrassment. They ripple outward. They recalibrate what everyone else is willing to accept. The most striking part wasn't that I won. It was how quickly everything changed once the truth was visible. Authority didn't collapse because of anger or revenge. It collapsed because it was built on unchecked assumption. That's the part people don't talk about. You don't have to be loud to be immovable. You don't have to escalate to win. You just have to know where you stand and refuse to step off ground that's legally yours. The lake didn't remember the conflict. The water never does, but the neighborhood did. Every interaction after that carried a new awareness, a quiet understanding that power has edges, and those edges matter. And every time I step onto that dock now, I'm reminded of something simple and dangerously easy to forget. Just because someone tells you to leave doesn't mean they have the right to ask.